I do want to just start off by letting you know that today's meeting is being recorded and we will be posting it to our Let's Talk Milton page following the meeting for any of those who are unable to attend. Thank you for joining us today for our user fee consultation meeting. My name is Jennifer Clute. I am the Manager of Financial Planning and Policy with the Town of Milton. Joining me as panelists today are Glenn Cowan, our CFO and Treasurer, along with Andrew Grunda, Sean Michael Stephen, and Tina Chitsindi from Watson and Associates. Greta from our Legal and Legislative Department will also be helping us to navigate the technical aspects of the meeting today. Thank you, Greta, for giving up some of your time today to help us with this. We also have staff from across various program areas with us, including planning, building, development engineering, infrastructure, licensing and enforcement, and finance. These staff are in attendance to hear any feedback and offer their support to the discussion as needed. We do have one of our counselors who may be joining us today. I'm not sure if he is on yet, but just to let you know that Councillor Clute may be joining us as well. The last comprehensive review and update of the town's user fees was completed in 2016, followed by a subsequent review and update to the town's building permit fees in 2018. Earlier this year, the town engaged Watson and Associates to undertake a current review of the town's fees and fee structure. The scope of the review included all town fees with the exception of recreation and transit. So just for clarity, the fees that were reviewed included the development application and approval fees, engineering, licensing, fire, as well as some of the more administrative type fees, with a large portion of the study focused on the fees associated with development. In terms of timeline, we are having the public consultation session today to outline draft findings and proposed updates to the fees. There will then be a 3-week period over which comments will be received. In accordance with the Building Code Act, there will be a statutory public meeting held at Council on September the 12th, 2022, to present the proposed building permit fee changes. We hope to address any concerns with proposed fees in advance of that meeting, such that Council will be able to approve the updated user fee bylaws at that same meeting. There is a Let's Talk Milton page to support the process, which is located from the main milton.ca webpage. It includes links to the current fee bylaws, the timeline of this project, draft report with findings and presentation materials, and provides another avenue for you to provide comments or feedback. We will leave time after the presentation today for comments and questions. In the event that we run short on time, please use the Let's Talk Milton page to provide further feedback. As mentioned earlier, we have representatives here from Watson and Associates who were retained by the town to undertake this study. I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Grunda from Watson and Associates to walk us through a slide deck today. Throughout the presentation, as questions come to mind, if you can use the raise hand feature in Zoom, we will keep an eye out, and following the presentation, Greta or myself will enable you to ask your questions or provide comments in the order that they were received. Andrew, it looks like you are enabled now to share your screen, so I will at this point turn it over to you, and thanks again everyone for finding time this afternoon to attend this presentation.
Thanks, Jennifer. So as was mentioned in the introduction by Jennifer, the town has retained Watson to complete a comprehensive fee review. The scope, as outlined, includes the majority of the fees in the town with the exception of recreation and transit. And the intent was for us to assist the town in reviewing the full cost of service in the context of the underlying legislation that governs those respective fees, and to assist them in determining fee recommendations that could be considered reflective of those costs, and also considering industry best practices, also considerations of affordability, and to present these to the stakeholders and receive their input on the matter as well. The purpose of the presentation today, again, as mentioned in the introduction, is to provide a summary of our findings that are detailed in our report, and to receive feedback from the stakeholders on the matter, to then allow us to finalize and bring this forward to council for their consideration. So in terms of the presentation, I'd first like to start by looking at a legislative context that governs the associated user fees that were considered as part of the scope of our assignment. What you'll see is that the fees that were considered are governed principally by three different statutes, the Planning Act, the Building Code Act, and the Municipal Act. Each of them having some slight distinctions with respect to their rules and setting user fees that municipalities have to comply with in undertaking these types of considerations. So the first is the Planning Act, and that is governed by Section 69 of the Planning Act that allows municipalities to recover the anticipated costs of processing each application type. It allows municipalities to impose those charges through a bylaw, and it's setting those fees through that bylaw. There is no statutory public process requirements. However, most municipalities do undertake stakeholder consultation in establishing these fees, such as the town has undertaken today. The fees can also be paid under protest because the bylaws themselves are not specifically subject to appeal to the OLT. But it's important to obviously make sure that the municipality is giving consideration to the legislative authority and making sure that they are reasonable relative to the potential for payment under protest. And when we look at that wording in the legislation, it speaks to cost justification by type, which is specific to that statute. And what we've seen is, as a result of that, municipalities have evolved the design of the fees, making sure that they have fee structures that are also responsive to differing characteristics of complexity and marginal cost attributes of applications. And so to further that, what we've seen in municipalities in that regard is to begin to move beyond just the type of application in their costing models, like the town of Milton has done, to differentiate between different uses, whether those be residential or non-residential, or levels of complexity. Also establishing marginal cost considerations and fee structures based on having flat fees or a combination of flat fees with per unit fees that may have decreasing block components related to them to reflect economies of scale, other surcharges for things like resubmissions or pre-consultation activities, so that they're not being incorporated into a broad overall fee, but trying to better align with the demands of the applicant. With respect to the Building Code Statute Law Amendment Act that amended the Building Code Act with respect to fees back in 2005, what it requires is that a municipality is allowed to impose fees, again, by bylaw, with respect to the issuance and application of permits. And the scope of the costs that can be considered in that regard is that they cannot exceed the anticipated reasonable costs of administration enforcement under the code as a whole. We have some further guidance in that legislation through the reporting that those costs are not just limited to direct costs of service, but can also include indirect and capital costs. And it also permits municipalities to have building code reserve funds, in that those funds can be used for that purpose. And as a result, most municipalities have established policies, like the town has, to identify reserve funds to allow for sustained service delivery through different economic downturns and economic cycles. And so building on that, the initial undertaking in 2005 as a result of the Building Code Statute Law Amendment Act, municipalities have also considered marginal cost aspects that are related to different types of permits in establishing those fees. So differentiating between new permits or alteration permits, or permits based on different groupings under the building code, to better understand those costs and align them with future development requirements. Finally, the last statutory authority that we've consulted as part of our exercise is the Part 12 fees and charges guidance that we see under the Municipal Act. Section 391 is the general fees and charges provisions for municipalities to impose these types of fees and charges through bylaw. It is much more broad in its context relative to the other statutes that we referred to earlier, allowing municipalities to impose fees for services or activities that they provide or that are done on their behalf, for costs that they may incur, or the use of their property. And those fees, again, we have some cost definition that provides guidance that they can include, again, not only direct costs, but also costs of administration, enforcement, and capital. Unlike the Building Code Act and the Planning Act, there is no direct cost justification requirements with respect to establishing these fees, but we need to ensure that they are user fees that reflect the benefits of services being conferred and not a tax, and therefore operating within the municipality statutory authority. Also, there is no mandatory public process requirements with respect to the Municipal Act fees and charges. But again, have been consulted on as part of this overall undertaking by the town today and historically in undertaking these reviews. So in the approach that we've taken in our study, we have worked with the town in the past in developing a costing model for the respective fees. That costing model generally has two components. One is referred to as an activity-based cost methodology, which is generally used for most of the fees that have been considered in our study. And this is looking to identify what the costs of the organization are for the activities undertaken by the individuals with respect to those different service delivery components that have fees associated with them. For other fees, what has been considered is more of a program-based approach that looks at either the facility utilization and the associated operating costs around that facility utilization that then define those fees, or other program-related aspects that look at the activities undertaken by those individuals with respect to the underlying fees and services that are being considered. In respect of both of those general approaches, which you'll see identified in detail in Chapter 2 of our report, we are first seeking to understand what are the full costs of the organization in providing those services and ultimately informing the fees that would be imposed to seek to recover those costs. And so in that full cost definition and with the guidance that we see from the legislative authority, what we include in here is the inclusion of both direct and indirect costs. The direct costs would be the capital costs of assets that are being deployed by the individuals providing the service and their associated operating costs that allow the organization to provide those services and benefits to the end user. Those direct costs generally constitute the majority of costs of service that we see in our costing models. And these individual costs that we're building on to identify those direct costs are informed by the municipality's 2022 operating budget. It also includes costs related to online payment processing. And for capital, what is being considered in here is the sinking fund of the amortization of assets that would be utilized by these individuals. But what also allows the municipality to provide these service to the end user is not just the direct cost involvement, but also the indirect costs that allow the organization to provide those services. And these are the costs of the organization that enable those frontline individuals to provide those services to applicants or to constituents. And these would be reflective of indirect costs such as human resource support or IT infrastructure and facility maintenance support of those direct operating departments. And the municipality uses a step cost approach, which is a fairly common costing approach to allocate those indirect costs to the frontline departments as part of determining the overall costs of service. You can see that illustrated on the next page of the presentation, where this is illustrating, for example, if we were looking at development services or other services that have been considered in the town's activity-based costing model, as you see illustrated on the far right-hand side, what we're attempting to understand is who are the direct cost participants. That's largely informed by something we'll refer to in a moment as a capacity analysis, where we've assessed the activities undertaken by the individuals in these frontline departments, whether that be community planning, engineering, clerks, or others. We've quality control tested those to make sure that those are reasonable and can be achieved by the municipality. And once we understand who's involved, the time that they spend across this cross-section of various programs and user fees, Then what we can do is assign the associated costs. So the direct costs largely being informed by their respective budgets, constituting salary, wage, and benefits, materials and supply costs, and the like. The capital costs that are being utilized by those individuals as well. And then also, as you can see in the left-hand side of the illustration, using that step cost approach to allocate support and overhead function costs to those departments based on their respective share of cost drivers. So if we're considering human resource support, looking at the relative human resources in those frontline departments, allow us to assign a share of those costs, have them nested with the direct costs of those departments, and then have them follow those individuals' involvement into the respective costing categories that then inform the fees. And as you heard me refer to a moment ago, the way we quality control test those allocations into those programs and the associated fees is through something called a capacity analysis. And what that allows us to do is to look at the various programs that are provided, the associated activities related to those programs. We can then look at the average amount of time that the various staff participants would spend on those processing activities or service delivery activities. And then we want to quality control test that because that's largely going to inform the cost of service. And the way we do that is we take the time that is devoted by the town to undertake those activities, multiply them by historic average volume levels over multiple years to weed out any cyclicality. That allows us to then determine the total amount of time that those resources would allocate into those respective activities and therefore into those various fee categories. We can then assess that to determine that that's reasonable relative to the available time that these individuals have to provide these services, and also in light of the fact that some of the activities these individuals may be undertaking are not user fee related programs. And so we work with the municipality, working through those assumptions to make sure that those are reasonable and reflective of their experience before we then assign the costs based on those allocations. Once we assign those costs, as you can see in the next slide as an example for a subdivision, we then want to use the guidance and some of the trending that we've seen in recent fee reviews to then consider how to effectively price that user fee to reflect those costs of service, and reflecting the fact that there are different characteristics around those costing objectives, whether they are size of application, complexity of application. We want to consider those, look at what those have been historically to better inform how we would then define a fee, whether that's a base charge, per unit fee, a combination thereof, to accurately reflect the cost of service and inform those fee recommendations. So with that, what I'd like to now do is just to move to the preliminary findings of our report and highlight those findings for you. So what you'll see on the screen is a summary of that capacity analysis that I referred to. So this is, you'll see the various departments and divisions that are included in the town's costing model, representing about 458 total full-time equivalent staff positions. What we were able to do in going through that assessment is determine the involvement of those full-time equivalent positions by department and division into the respective broader costing fee categories based on those activities. And what we see is that this comprises generally of two major categories: development-related fees and non-development related fees. Of the total staff complement of 458 equivalent positions, we see that about 93 full-time equivalent positions are being consumed in these underlying fee activities and based on those historic average volume levels. The majority of that time is for staff that are dedicated to development-related fee reviews. They constitute about 75% of those total full-time equivalents, and we generally see those in the middle of this illustration in the divisions and departments from development services through development engineering. And so they account for about roughly 70 full-time equivalent positions that are provided to support those services and the underlying volumes of those applications and processing. With respect to the non-development fees, what we see is that the greatest involvement of those areas generally come from finance and legislative services and legal, as well as fire in that regard. With respect to the development fees in particular, what we see is that the building department is generally fully engaged in user fee recovery activities, about 95% of their time being devoted to those under the authority of the Building Code Act, about 5% under the Planning Act. For the development review group, the majority of their time is allocated towards planning applications, representing about 90% of their time. A small amount of their time is also allocated into licensing fees. But as you'll see, unlike building, the development review group is not allocated 100% into fees. This is reflective of the fact that that division and department is spending time on non-planning processing applications, such as appeals, capital projects, and the like. And we see a similar attribution when we look at planning policy, that a fairly significant amount of their time, about 85% of their time, is being allocated into capital projects and policies and appeals. And so only about 14% of their time is actually being considered and included in the costing of planning and development applications. So with that utilization of staff, which again is built on the processing estimates of time and activities across a variety of costing categories, we've summarized what the associated costs of service would be. As you can see summarized on the table, we've broken that down between non-development fees and the development fees, and then the subsequent broader categorization within those two subsections. Overall, what we see is that on an annual basis, user fee costs to the town are approximately $17.3 million. When we looked at those underlying volumes, and we applied the current fee schedules of the town today, it suggests that the municipality is recovering about 84% of those costs in aggregate across development and non-development, totaling about $14.5 million in annual revenues. Again, what we can see when we look at the costs that are apparent in the model is that, like we've seen in past modeling of the town, as we've seen in other municipalities, about 83% of the costs are reflective of direct costs and capital costs of providing service. The indirect costs of support to those frontline departments is about 17% of that overall cost. And when we start to break that down further between non-development and development, what we can see is that the non-development related fees, again, represent about 24% of that total $17 million in annual costs, and are recovering about 54% of those costs. And you can see that the town does a fairly good job of recovering its costs of clerks and licensing, less so around some of the other town-wide fees and some of the other fee types that are provided in detail in our report. The development-related fees are providing better overall cost recovery in that regard. The cost of service, again, about 76% of the total 17 million, or about $13 million a year. Revenues based on historic volumes and current pricing are recovering about 94% of those costs. As we can see, the building department is doing an effective job of recovering its costs of service. However, when we look at planning and engineering, those are under recovering to a greater degree. So to look at those in a bit more detail in the presentation on the next page, we've talked about the non-development fees. And so in our report, you'll see that the non-development fees have been considered based on the authority of the Municipal Act. We've looked to identify not only better recovery of the full costs of service, but also having that informed by competitiveness of those fees by the town relative to other municipalities, and considering the affordability aspects of the applicants and the constituents that those fees are being applied to for their service demands. And so to do that in our methodology, in addition to understanding the costing, We've compared those fees with a number of municipalities in the surrounding area, as you can see summarized in the second bullet of this slide. That allows us to then determine how the municipality can proceed relative towards full cost recovery in light of the competitive market that they're surrounded by for similar service offerings. And so in our report, you'll see that in total, what has been identified is an increase in user fee revenue about 12% with those fee recommendations, which would allow the municipality to achieve approximately $300,000 annually in additional revenue beyond current recovery levels. And that's premised on historic volume composition. So then turning to the development related fees and looking at the three major categories of planning, building, and engineering. When we look at the planning application fees in detail, what we see is that the municipality is currently recovering about 54% of the total cost of service, which represents a shortfall of about $1.8 million a year in annual processing costs. And in our report, what you'll see is that there's principally four areas that make up the majority of that $1.8 million shortfall. Local official plan amendments, as well as minor variance applications, are recovering around 45% of their total cost of service. Those are each contributing to a shortfall of about $200,000 a year to the municipality in those recovery levels. Also, when we look at site plan, that seems to be the biggest area in terms of the overall dollar value of recovery shortfall, representing about $1 million in annual shortfall of costs for site plan, only recovering about 25% of the cost of service. And zoning bylaw amendment recovering about 64% of their cost of service, but again, given the overall weighting of that relative to other applications, that represents about a shortfall of about $300,000 a year to the municipality. So those are generally the four major areas that we've seen under recovery that are accounting for the results of planning applications in total. Also, when we look at that fee review, we can also see that there are other fees that are over recovering their costs, and those have been recommended to be moved back to full cost recovery. Those consider applications such as communication tower applications, part law control exemptions, extension of draft plan approval for condominium and subdivision, for example. And so overall, the intent in establishing these fees was again to look to move to full cost, again, relative to market considerations and cost of service of the municipality. And to do that, considering those aspects of affordability and competitiveness. And so in our detailed handout that accompanied the proposal today, you'll see a summary of the various fees, the current fees and the proposed fees. Would highlight that in there, in addition to the increases to some of these under recovering fees and the reductions for some of the over recovering fees, there are also new fees that have been identified for pre-consultation, for administration services related to OLT appeals, and for cash in lieu of parking application fees. And you'll see those highlighted on the screen, but also provided in that separate handout. Overall, based on the underlying modeling of the fee recommendations and those historic volumes, we would anticipate that that would add about $1.3 million in additional revenue annually if that composition remains consistent going forward. And that cost recovery would improve from about 54% to 86% overall for planning application fees. Looking at the building permit fees, again, the building permits are allowed to be established relative to the costs of administration enforcement under the code. They can also provide for a reserve fund for funding towards a reserve fund to allow to have sustainability built into the pricing and operation under the building code. As we saw earlier, the current fees are contributing about 12% of revenue to the reserve fund. And again, that's based on historic average volume levels and current pricing. The establishing of these fees, however, what we want to consider is how would these fees perform over a forecast volume profile if the fees were unchanged And based on current pricing and that anticipated volume, do we require any fee adjustments? So one of the things that you'll see identified in our report in detail is that even before considering a forecast of the anticipated costs, when we look at the current fees and how they are performing, there are 3 areas in residential permit fees that are underperforming relative to cost currently. Those are low density permits that are recovering about 91% of their total costs, medium density permits and stacked townhouses that are recovering about 22% of their costs, and residential alterations recovering about 13% of their costs. So in light of those initial costing observations, what we've done is we've worked with the municipality to identify a forecast of anticipated development to 2027. We had consulted the municipality's current policy that was initially established in 2005 to maintain a target of 2 times direct costs in the reserve fund to guard against any economic downturn that would allow them to sustain staff and be able to meet the legislative requirements upon recovery of those downturns. And in light of that, what we've determined is that the municipality should look to continue to index their permit fees, but to make more significant adjustments to reflect the under recovery performance of low density and medium density permits as well. And so what is being proposed is that in addition to the indexing, that the low density and medium density residential permits would have phased in increases to 2025 to allow the municipality to maintain its reserve fund guidance and to provide that service sustainability. And so you'll see that summarized on the next page, where we've modeled the annual direct costs and revenues. We've indexed those costs at 2% per year. We've looked at indexing the building permit fees and the fee adjustments to low and medium density residential. And as you can see in the bottom part of the illustration, the current multiple of 1.5 would improve to roughly that 2 times multiple by the end of the forecast period in 2027, and doing so in a gradual way by phasing in those non-index fee adjustments over that 3-year period to 2025. With respect to the engineering and inspection fees within the broader development fee portfolio, the municipality imposes these fees for subdivision site plans and condominiums based on the construction value of capital assets. The municipality has considered this in the past and has updated that methodology by looking at their job costing database, which identifies the costs of service that they've incurred between 2017 and 2021, and being able to contrast that to the underlying construction value of assets and the revenue performance. And what that shows is that the current fees today are recovering about 93% of the costs. They're doing a pretty good job in terms of recovering the overall cost of service. However, there are some revisions that are required in that fee structure to close that gap and to be able to achieve that overall recovery level. And so what you'll see on the next slide is the current fees relative to the intervals of construction value for which those percentages are imposed, how those are currently performing, and then the recommendation to begin to increase those fees for construction value greater than $500,000, with the exception of that at the interval of 1.5 to 5 million that's performing well relative to the cost of service, to begin to close that gap and to move towards full cost recovery. And so the last area around development fees that I just wanted to highlight are the per unit processing fees and the streetlight and winter maintenance fees. And so the per unit processing fees are for development applications post approval that are undertaken for staff time allocated by non-planning staff. That's being recovered. And as we mentioned earlier, the current fee is currently sufficiently recovering those costs. So there's no proposed change to those fees, that they would be maintained. Also, the municipality imposes fees for street lighting and winter maintenance on unassumed roads. As you can see in the summary table below, the municipality has looked at the updated costs of hydro and maintenance activities and provided some adjustments to those costs, to those fees, increasing winter maintenance fees by about 8%, reductions for the street lighting component of those fees, and about a 2% overall increase with respect to traffic lights. So in conclusion, when we build all of those fee recommendations in place, as you can see summarized on the next page, the overall revenues to the municipality between non-development and development fees would be expected to increase by about $2.1 million over that period of time. The overall cost recovery would improve from about 84% to about 97%, adding about, again, $300,000 annually to non-development related fees and about $1.9 million to development related. And so to put those development related fees in some context, what we've also included in our presentation is the development impacts that are, again, included in our report, looking at the recommended planning and building permit fee adjustments and how those would impact costs of development. So what you'll see in the next 3 slides is that we've looked at a residential, retail, and industrial development type. We've looked at various planning applications that these developments would go through, included the total municipal costs of planning, building, and development charges to gauge the impact that these recommendations would have. And so in this first instance, we're considering a 200 single detached unit subdivision, going through the process of an official plan zoning bylaw amendment, as well as a plan of subdivision and building permit fees. Incorporating the DCs, those fees are currently about $100,000 per unit. The planning and building component of those fees is about $4,700 per unit, or about 4% of that overall cost. The recommended planning and building fees would add about $650 per unit to the overall cost of this type of a development, representing about an increase of 0.7% in terms of the total cost to this type of a development, maintaining the town's current position relatively around the average of the other comparable municipalities. And we see similar results when we look at retail on the next page and industrial on the page following that. The retail consideration for a 1,000 square meter retail development proceeding through site plan, zoning bylaw, and building permit would have total costs of municipal cost of development of about $700,000. About 11% of that, or about $47,000, pertains to building and planning fees. The proposals under building and planning would add about 3% to that overall cost of development, or adding about $20,000 to that total municipal application cost. And lastly, with respect to industrial, in looking at an industrial site developing at about 10,000 square meters of gross floor area, again, going through site plan, zoning bylaw, and building permit approvals, the current fees paid of about $2.3 million would increase by about $80,000. So about a 3% increase to that overall cost of development based on the planning and building recommendations from our report. So that concludes our summary of our report and the recommendations and findings of that report. As mentioned in the introduction, the next part of the process is to design to receive input from the stakeholders, to review those and consider those with town staff, and consider if there's any adjustments that are required that would come forward to council for their consideration on September the 12th. Once those fees are brought forward to council, if they are considered and adopted, they would come into effect for January 1st, 2023, with the associated indexing for building permit fees commencing on January 1st, 2023, and all other fees would be indexed starting on January 1st in accordance with the town's municipal price index, which is estimated about 5.9% for 2003. And so that concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to address any questions.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for the presentation. I don't currently see any hands raised, but if there is anybody that has any questions or initial comments from the presentation, we would be happy to take them at this time. So we do have a question from Lino Melito. Sorry, just one second, and I will unmute you so that you can ask your question. Oh, Greta, have you?
I have already
All right.
unmuted Dino. Okay.
Can you
Go
hear
ahead.
me?
Yes, go
Okay,
ahead.
great. Thank you. Yeah, as you said, my name is Lino Melito. I'm with Orlando Corporation. I know we had a general overview here of the fees and how the study has gone in an overall sense, but I wanted to speak specifically to building permit fees as they apply to industrial buildings. And specifically the difference between constructing a shell industrial building and then continuing with the alteration permit after that. There seems to be quite a discrepancy between taking a phased approach to constructing an industrial building as opposed to coming in with a fully completed, fully partitioned building. If we look at the numbers, and I have discussed this with the chief building official on occasion about why there is a $5.18 square meter difference between taking a phased approach and coming in with a fully partitioned building. That's particularly problematic for industrial developers because the process often begins with the construction of a shell, and that's marketed. And when we obtain a tenant, then we have a layout and we come back and submit for the interiors. So by comparison, a shell and an alteration permit phased approach is $18.98 a square meter, as opposed to coming in with a fully partitioned building, which is $13.80. If we have a look at other municipalities, Mississauga, for example, the phased approach is actually less expensive than coming in with a finished building. And in Brampton, for example, they're equal. So I'm just wondering if there was any thought process behind that, or what the thinking was there, or if that's something you would even consider looking at, for your presentation to council. The other item that I wanted to discuss is similarly is the fee for conditional permits. So currently, conditional permits in Brampton, and again, I'm bringing up municipalities where we do a lot of business in, are $3,500. And in Mississauga, they cap it for industrial buildings at $8,900. I'm rounding off. And in Milton, it's currently $120,000 for a conditional permit. And in fact, it's been a deterrent for us to start development in many cases because of the cost. I don't know if the city intends it to be a deterrent, but it certainly does become one when you factor in. And the reason for that is that Mississauga and Brampton do cap it, whereas Milton takes 25% of the permit fee. So you can imagine on a 500,000 square foot building, that's in the vicinity of $120,000 to $130,000. So again, I don't know if that's in the scope of your review here, but it's certainly, I felt it was the forum to sort of express my opinion on that.
Sure. So, Andrew, I don't know if you want to speak to that now. Otherwise, I was just going to say that that's something that we can take that away and connect back with you on afterwards, once we've had a chance to speak more about it internally.
Okay. Sure. I think that's fine. I think just to Lino's point, just to identify that in the costing model that we've developed, we've considered those conditional permits, and based on the costing, there's a recommendation that percentage would go down in terms of that conditional. So I think that the 100,000 must be based on a calculation of a certain application type that I think Lino's referring to. Because to my understanding is that we've established that and identified that would go from 25% to 20% through this review based on the costing results of conditional permits. And then in terms of industrial, again, in the modeling, we've looked at those industrial types relative to the underlying effort of staff. in that regard. And so in the scope of our review, that's what it has produced in terms of the respective effort in that regard. So I just wanted to highlight that, Jennifer. But again, if there's further consideration, then we can address that as well.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we've taken note of those comments, and we will take those away.
Jennifer, I do have two further attendees wanting to speak. I will unmute them in that order. First, we have Mara, and then we have Carlo. Mara, I'm going to allow you to speak right now.
Great, thanks, Greta. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Andrew. I am wondering, how are the new Planning Act requirements for fee refunds based on any failure to meet the application review timing obligations being considered in the analysis?
So Jennifer, I'm happy to address how we addressed it in our fee review. So, I mean, in terms of our fee review, it was to consider what those costs of service are under the authority of the Planning Act. So if the municipality is required to have to provide refunds with respect to turnaround times, then obviously this would provide them with a way to estimate what those costs of service would be that would be under recovered, that would not have fee support for them. But beyond that, I think the only way that's generally been considered in our review is looking at things like pre-consultation and trying to identify some of those service activities that could be established before that processing clock starts, in essence.
Okay, so I mean, recognizing the intent of that change in the legislation, I just wanted to confirm that there wasn't anything underwritten in your modeling that assumed a certain percentage and thus increased the fee or anything like that. Sorry, assumed a certain percentage of refunded fees and thus increase the fee to any degree.
Yeah, like I'm not sure necessarily about the comment. I mean, if the comment is that if we were anticipating refunds that we then somehow added back in to increase fees, we haven't done that because in our opinion that wouldn't be possible under the requirements of Section 69.
Okay, great, thanks.
Christian has also indicated that he can speak to this and add a little bit more context. Greta, if you are able to unmute Christian.
Sure.
Hi, it's Chris Lupus, Director of Development Review. Just tomorrow to your question, yeah, like Andrew had noted, Bill 109 really wasn't taken into account with respect to our review of the fees. We are, as a municipality, working with our other municipalities with the region of Halton. I actually have a meeting next Friday regarding Bill 109 and the refund structure and implications to the town and how we're going to be dealing with that. Again, not influencing the actual amount of the fees, but really how we're going to have to deal with applications in light of that, which may be, as Andrew had suggested, a lot of the heavy lifting at pre-submission. We're looking at the use of holding provisions potentially to get around that, as well as we're looking at another item was pre-submissions, holding submissions, and then potentially working with Bill actually with respect to some legislation to see what can come down the pipe in terms of a waiver or as per the developer's request kind of thing. So we're looking at different options, but again, the point is basically that the fee structure wasn't modeled around Bill 109 at all. Hope that clarifies.
Thank you, Chris. Greta, I believe we have another.
Yeah, I have allowed Carlo to ask his question. Carlo, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having the opportunity to be part of this today. I have a couple of comments and I have a few questions, and I'll start off with some comments. I'm glad to see that there's a fee for pre-consultation, because I think that process of having a pre-consultation with our municipal partners is good, because it hopefully will help ensure that applications are complete, and that it should improve processing time and efficiency. A lot of times in the past, that wasn't the case. With regards to the process, the priorities, and the complexities of applications, those are all things that are in the town's control, not ours. So I think one thing we may want to look at on some of these areas where we're finding challenges with time and cost is to perhaps consider looking at the process and perhaps seeing if we're getting the value out of it. Maybe there's some complexity that we've added that isn't generating value that we can eliminate that might help reduce the costs. There hasn't been much discussion in this presentation about peer review fees that developers are asked to pay on top of these fees. So I'm not sure where they fit in this conversation, and how perhaps we can include them in this conversation. One thing I want the town to consider, and it's not a deal breaker, is perhaps the timing of payment. Maybe you pay 75% upfront and 25% when you get your permit or your approval. I think that might help provide some incentives to get through the process more efficiently. I have a question with regards to what's included in the street light maintenance fee. Our experience is that we pay that fee, but we're still asked to maintain the streetlights. So if we can just get an understanding of what's included, then that might help us when we're asked to replace light bulbs and straighten poles prior to maintenance and assumption. So that could be just information. The last thing is, if you guys could perhaps provide us, you did provide us those tables that showed how you compare to other jurisdictions when you combine development charges with your building and planning fees. Can we maybe just focus on the fees and get rid of the development charge? Because that might skew things. Some places might have really high development charges, but their fees might be more efficient. So just to understand apples to apples, we are talking about fees today. So I wouldn't mind to see how the town's new fees compare to other municipalities' fees, not the combination of fees and DCs. Thank you.
Andrew, I'm not sure if you're going to have anything to speak to on that. Some of those comments, I've taken note of all of them. We will take them away. I will look into the streetlight maintenance fee for you, and we'll just take a look at that. In terms of how our fees comparing just the user fees to the other municipal fees, posted on the Let's Talk Milton site now is a full report from Watson and Associates, and included in that are tables that speak just to each of the fees. You will be able to see for just the user fees, the proposed increases, and as well attached to the appendix at the back of that report is a municipal comparator that will show how the current fees of the town compare to the municipalities that we compared ourselves against.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much.
And I am not seeing any other hands raised. So yeah, just a last call for any questions that anyone has right now. Okay, again, I am not seeing any. So as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, we will post a link to this presentation on the Let's Talk Milton page. On that page, you will also be able to see a draft of the full report with findings and proposed fees, like I just mentioned. I also just wanted to make note, referenced in today's presentation was a handout number 1 for planning fees. We had considered providing a handout, but as that information is also included in the draft report, we did not end up circulating an additional handout. As mentioned earlier, there will be a 3-week period over which additional comments can be received, ideally through the Let's Talk Milton page. And we have taken note of all of the comments received today. We welcome any additional feedback or comments. Following that 3-week period, in accordance with the Building Code Act, there will be a statutory public meeting held at Council on September the 12th. And as mentioned previously, also, we anticipate that at that same meeting, Council will consider and approve the updated user fee bylaws. So again, I don't think I am seeing anyone else with any questions. So once again, thank you so much for your time today. And we look forward to any further thoughts and feedback anyone has as we move forward. Thank you very much.